Now we continue to follow breaking news. The Georgia election interference case finally reaching an end. Fulton County Judge Scott McAfee dismissed all charges this morning against President Donald Trump and his 14 remaining co-defendants.
Really big news out today. That ruling came less than an hour after Special Prosecutor Pete Scandalacis, he told the courts he believed the case should not move forward to, quote, serve the interest of justice and promote judicial finality. President Trump posting on Truth Social in part, law and justice have prevailed in the great state of Georgia as the corrupt Fani Willis witch hunt against me and other great American patriots has been dismissed in its entirety. Well, 11 Alive's Grace King has been following this case when it was brought down in 2023 to now, joining us live here in the newsroom. Grace, where this case was stalled for nearly 2 years.
Grace, why won't it resume?
Well, Special Prosecutor Pete Scandalacis says this case was on life support when it came before the Prosecuting Attorneys Council of Georgia, and that he had to decide whether there was enough evidence for it to survive. He says his review raised too many questions about the case's jurisdiction, findings, and timeline for the prosecution to continue forward. There's not a lot in the 2020 election interference indictment that Pete Scandalacis would take to trial.
The document that he submitted to the court goes through his thinking about all of the different charges against all of the different people.
In the fake elector allegations, where several defendants are accused of having 16 Republicans meet at the Georgia State Capitol to sign electoral college documents falsely claiming Trump won Georgia in 2020, Scandalacis wrote he found no criminal intent behind their plan to challenge the election results. In Coffee County, where several defendants are accused of illegally accessing and inspecting voting software and copying election data, two defendants, Sidney Powell and Scott Hall, had already pled guilty. Scandalacis says they played the key roles in that scheme and felt further prosecution is unwarranted.
I have to find 12,000 votes, and I have them times a lot, and therefore I won the state.
And in this infamous leaked call between President Donald Trump and Georgia Secretary of State Brad Raffensperger, where Trump pressed him on Georgia's results and referenced the number of votes needed to put him ahead of Biden, Scandalacis says he believes there are two equally plausible interpretations and that the burden of proof is on the state, not the defendants.
It's absolutely true that RICO cases take a lot of time. They take a lot of witnesses. There's often a lot of documentary evidence that jurors have to follow along with, and it can be a very complicated narrative.
Plus, Emory law professor Kay Levine says you have to factor in politics.
Jury selection would take a very long time to find people who don't know very much about the case or hadn't formed pre-existing notions about guilt or innocence for any of the alleged co-conspirators.
Scandalacis says there is no realistic prospect that a sitting president will be compelled to appear in Georgia to stand trial on the allegations in this indictment, and that separating his case from the others would be both illogical and unduly burdensome and costly for the state and for Fulton County. And Scandalacis says he knows his decision will not be universally popular, but that his job is not to satisfy public opinion. He says his decision was guided solely by the evidence, laws, and principles.
So, what are your thoughts?
I've been saying the same thing for a long time. The case was garbage. It was politically motivated. It is a classic example of what has come to be termed lawfare. It is a scandalous disregard for the tone and intent of the Bill of Rights, which was ratified and adopted in 1791 to prevent such abuse of the criminal power and authority of the government for political oppression. Fani Willis needs to be jacked up for doing what she did. It was un-American. It was fascist. And every time I hear one of her party members talk about they are trying to do something to stop fascism, I look at things like this and what Tish James did in New York and some other individual, Smith, and I just say it stinks to high heavens of fascism and the use of the authority of the United States to stifle all disagreement. In other words, anything that gets done is supposed to be uncoordinated in the political realm, which just doesn't happen. It's supposed to be undiscussed, which is inappropriate. and it's supposed to be what we say has to be done, or a disagreement results in prosecution. And that is just plain political evil. It reeks of the National Socialist Party. But this one in Germany, and this one with a German acronym that's spelled Nazi, that's Nazi. And also, I'm concerned about the flip the script thing that they do with propaganda. Not they, but is done with propaganda, where you accuse the other side of doing exactly what you're doing to diffuse the attention of the public and distract the public. So I see the Democratic Party is throwing the term around fascist and Nazi against the Republican Party, but from all objective analysis, it suggests that the Democratic Party is the one that is attempting to, in fact, implement the totalitarian government. And I suppose what they're trying to do is typical of their do-good, entitlement, DEI, take care of everybody, make everyone dependent philosophy that they've had for decades. Is we're going to protect you from yourself, so we will make sure that you have no say-so in what happens to you, and we will keep you in your cradle from birth to grave. And that's what we're looking at.
So now that the Georgia election interference case is officially dismissed, what happens next? Can any of the defendants press charges against Fani Willis' office?
No, there's an indictment that intervenes that takes the liability of the office out of the picture. See, the grand jury is immune, and what winds up happening is, even if the presentation to the grand jury is totally inadequate, totally biased, or whatever, the grand jury's action takes it out of the hands of the people who initiated the process, and that it protects them from liability. Now, what happens afterwards? Yeah, maybe. But the problem becomes one of proof, and it's a matter of diminishing returns. The real way to punish what happened is to turn the scoundrels out of office the next election, or if they have a recall provision in the state.
Fulton County people are not going to vote her out.
Oh, I know, but they've got a saying in American politics: the constituency deserves the representation that it gets. And if you've got a constituency that is not very adept at making choices, then you can expect that to carry over into who they choose to represent them.
And one last thing, right? In the meantime, right now, because I know we're gonna still talk about Fani Willis, because she still has to sit in front of the Georgia Senate committee.
Yeah, and the problem is there's $10 million of Georgia taxpayers' money that seems to be missing. That's 7.5 to catch up with prosecutions that were long overdue. That's $500,000 for juvenile prosecutions, and that was $2 million to catch up on prosecution of sex crimes. So that's 10 million total that seems to have disappeared, and she doesn't want to answer and seems to think she's immune. Mm-hmm. And then we still have the federal matter with the knowingly false statement issue to a federal agency or agent, specifically IRS, the perjury, the misstatements, the elements of money laundering that came to light from her very foolishly delivered testimony during the initial portions of these proceedings that just got dismissed. In fact, it's one of the dumbest acts I've ever seen in my career. the head prosecutor for a major city, not realizing the ramifications of the Fifth Amendment. And instead of remaining silent, she goes and stands up, put hands on hip, waggles her head like she's a snake charmer, and gets up, and Judge McAfee says, "Ma'am, what's the matter? We may not even require that you give any testimony." Well, I decided I was going to. And she gets up, la-di-da, dress on backwards and upside down. And it's
It was
just absolutely pathetic. It was on backwards. But anyway, the pen was upside down, the American pen. But that said, she incriminated herself and exposed a lot of criminal activity on her part.
The whole case was bizarre. Her behavior, their evidence. So this special prosecutor, how you pronounce his name? Scandalacis. He says he shredded the case against Trump and other defendants, noting.
Think scandal.
Huh?
Think scandal when you pronounce it.
Oh, okay. Scandalacis.
Scandalacis, yeah. Go ahead.
He shredded the case against Trump and other defendants, noting that it was premised on biased assumptions about individuals' motives. For example, he criticized Fani Willis for charging the former New York City mayor, Rudy Giuliani, and others over their statements to the Georgia legislator. So the whole case, from beginning to end, appointing Nathan Wade, come to find out you were sleeping with him, he was your boyfriend, money, everything.
It was stealing money, taxpayers' money. And she had no one to answer to. And they'd already paid him $750,000 for doing it, what was about $15,000 worth of preparatory investigation, which is very high when you are taking cases in appointed matter. It's absurd. Let's say somebody had been appointed to represent someone in a capital murder case meaning, in other words, the death penalty is demanded, which is probably the most critical type of representation in a criminal matter one can get. And that would have resulted in a much, much smaller fee. But they just sat there and gouged, and $750,000 for preliminary work was just absolutely absurd. And the interesting thing was, they probably could have gotten away with billing the state from about $6 to $8 or $9 million out of this. And nobody would have known the difference if she hadn't got up and run her mouth.
I have one more question on this. How much power does a district attorney have? Because she the one who can say, I'm going to pay you this amount, or pay you that amount. How much power overall do they have? Because you said they don't have no one.
She stands for the state. And when you say in an indictment, the people of the state of Georgia, the people of the state of New Jersey, of Ohio, people of the state of Tennessee, there are several million people in the state, whichever one it is, unless you get this DC thing where you wouldn't even have a third of a million people in it, where Washington, DC would be a state, which is a scam. But that prosecutor stands for those people, represents those people, and directs the action of those people. And remember, there are 1, 2, 3 elements in our system: legislative body that makes the laws, the executive function that carries out the law, and the district attorney is part of that executive function. And then thirdly, you have a situation where you have the judiciary that steps in for the triumvirate there. to interpret the law and render judgments. Now, that would also include juries as well. Now, the Attorney General of the United States acts as a secretary for the President of the United States. And in states, generally, what happens is the Attorney General of the state acts as an elected constitutional official who is part of the executive function of the state. So the Attorney General, essentially in a place like Georgia, would be directing the resources of the state for purposes of either defending the state or prosecuting on behalf of the state against people who do things sufficiently egregiously to establish probable cause that they have done something against the public peace, dignity, and order that is so unacceptable as to require that they stand trial and give the state the opportunity to prove its case beyond a reasonable doubt, which, if established, then subjects the offending party or parties to deprivation of their rights, or in certain cases, like capital case, deprivation of their lives.